Scribbling chaos. I begged my stepdad Aiden, 55, ex-editor, to save my Denver essay. His hand gripped mine, pen trembling, ink burned wild. Mom's away, 2 weeks flared hot, too hot. One pause broke it, what tore us apart? You'll choke. 2 days after the kitchen essay fiasco, I was still wired from Aiden's warm hand guiding mine, his green eyes flickering with something I couldn't unsee. Mom was still pulling late shifts at the store. Her last text a curt bet I'd finish my homework, not even close. I wandered into Aiden's home office that afternoon, a cozy den of bookshelves, scattered manuscripts, and the faint scent of ink and cedar. Aiden, 55, ex-newspaper editor turned freelancer, sat at his desk, red pen in hand, marking up a client's draft, his faded flannel open over a dark tee, jeans worn, gray stubble sharp under the desk lamp. He didn't look up, just muttered I'd better not touch his edits, bet I'd scribble chaos. I grinned, flirty, perched on the desk's edge, my sneakers brushing his chair, saying he looked hot with red ink, bet he'd rewrite me wild. He smirked, flipped a page, and said wild didn't flirt, bet I'd smudge his margins. I slid closer, my hip grazing a stack of papers, teasing that smudging was my style, bet he'd polish it anyway. He glanced up, his hand brushing a pen by my wrist, fingers lingering, and said polishing was my dodge, bet I'd throw his notes off. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying throwing was my spark, bet he'd catch it sharp. He smirked, marked a line, his arm nudging mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this markup. I grabbed a manuscript page, flirty, scanning it, teasing that owing was my hook, bet he'd revise it with that grin. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, saying revising was my bluff, bet I'd botch the prose. I laughed, flirty, saying botching was my kick, bet he'd fix it anyway. He smirked, handed me a pen, muttering fixing was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I leaned in, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd print it clean, started bickering about style, he swore by concise leads, I pushed for flowery intros, flirty, saying I'd outwrite him, bet I'd steal the byline. He laughed, said I'd ramble, bet I'd bore the reader. I grabbed his coffee mug, flirty, waving it, saying I'd show him, bet I'd brew a better story. He smirked, reached for it, and my elbow knocked the mug, brown splashing his flannel. I gasped, giggling, snatching a rag, dabbing his chest, my fingers lingering, flirty, saying oops, bet I'd owe him big. He caught my wrist, light, teasing, muttering owing was my chaos, bet I'd stain him worse. I leaned in, my shoulder brushing his chest, flirty, saying staining was my vibe, bet he'd wear it anyway. He smirked, took the rag, his hand grazing my arm, muttering wearing was my snare, bet I'd mess him more. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying messing was my thrill, bet he'd clean it up. We negotiated a mock fine, I'd owe him a coffee run, flirty, teasing he'd pick decaf, bet I'd spike it. He laughed, said I'd brew trouble, bet I'd burn the beans. The office hummed, papers rustling, and I stayed close, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the manuscript, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd wreck this draft. I stood, flirty, saying he looked too good editing, bet he'd spark my words. He smirked, saved the file, his arm brushing my shoulder, muttering sparking was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying reeling was my bet he'd bite it hard. The tension crackled, coffee drying, and I knew I'd hooked him, manuscript marked. Stakes soaring. 5 days after the coffee-soaked office flirt, the Denver afternoon was crisp, the downtown literary fair a swirl of bookstalls, live readings, and the scent of ink and pretzels. Mom was still on her late shifts at the store, her last text a curt bet I'd stay focused on school, not even in the realm of possibility. I'd been replaying Aiden's steady grip, his teasing smirks, and they'd burrowed deeper than I'd meant. I'd dragged him to the fair, betting his ex-editor instincts could out-hunt me in finding a rare first-edition poetry collection I needed for a class project. He weaved through the crowd, a worn leather jacket over a dark tee, jeans faded, gray stubble sharp under the sunlight. He muttered I'd better not lose him, bet I'd pick a dud. I grinned, oh flirty, spun in my sweater and jeans, my boots kicking dust, saying he looked hot with books, bet he'd snag me a gem. He smirked, scanned a stall, and said gems didn't flirt, bet I'd fumble the find. I darted toward a table piled with old tomes, teasing that fumbling was my angle, bet he'd grab it sharp. He followed, his hand brushing a book by my elbow, fingers twitching, saying grabbing was my dodge, bet I'd throw his hunt off. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying throwing was my spark, bet he'd chase it clean. He smirked, flipped through a dusty volume, his arm grazing mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this score. I grabbed a battered copy of Whitman, flirty, holding it up, challenging him to find better, bet I'd win. He laughed, saying I'd picked trash, bet I'd miss the prize. I bolted to another stall, teasing I'd show him, bet I'd take the crown. He chased, dodging browsers, shouting I'd grab a romance, bet I'd blush. I spotted a rare Frost collection, lunged, but my boot caught a rug, and I stumbled, tumbling onto a carpet between stalls, laughing, my sweater shifting. Aiden Dove, catching my waist, his hands firm, pulling me up, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a wreck, bet I'd wreck his hunt, and why pulse raced, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my vibe, bet he'd save the book. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing saving was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd chase it anyway. We grabbed teas from a vendor, and I sipped, flirty, but my elbow knocked his cup, green splashing his jacket. I gasped, giggling, snatching a napkin, dabbing his chest, flirty, saying oops, bet I'd owe him big. He caught my wrist, light, teasing, muttering owing was my chaos, bet I'd soak him worse. I leaned in, my shoulder brushing his chest, flirty, saying soaking was my thrill, bet he'd wear it. He smirked, took the napkin, his hand grazing my arm, muttering wearing was my snare, bet I'd mess him more. The fair pulsed, dusk falling, and I stayed close, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the book, muttering flaring was my hustle, bet I'd blur this day. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying blurring was my bet he'd bite it hard. The tension hummed, fairground fading, and I knew I'd hooked him, books stacked, stakes soaring. The Denver evening was soft, the kitchen of our house glowing with the warm hum of an old radio playing a bluesy tune, the air thick with sugar and vanilla. Mom was still on her late store shifts, her last text a brisk bet I'd keep the place tidy, not a chance. I'd been replaying Aiden's steady smirks, his firm catches at the fair, and they'd sunk deeper than I'd meant, a pull I couldn't shake. I stood at the counter, mixing cookie dough in a loose tee and shorts, flour dusting my hands, my hair tied back in a messy bun. Aiden, 55, ex-newspaper editor turned freelancer, came in, a bag of chocolate chips in hand, his faded flannel open over a dark tee, jeans scuffed, green eyes glinting under the kitchen light. He dropped the bag, his fingers brushing a spoon by my wrist, muttering I'd better not burn the batch, bet I'd torch the oven. I grinned, flirty, flicked a pinch of flour at him, saying he looked hot with ingredients, bet he'd bake me sweet. He smirked, grabbed a mixing bowl, and said sweet didn't flirt, bet I'd clump the dough. I slid closer, my hip grazing the counter by his arm, teasing that clumping was my charm, bet he'd taste it anyway. He tossed in the chips, his hand brushing a measuring cup by my elbow, fingers lingering, and said tasting was my dodge, bet I'd throw his recipe off. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying throwing was my spark, bet he'd mix it sharp. He smirked, stirred the batter, his arm nudging mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this tray. I grabbed a spoon, flirty, scooping dough, teasing that owing was my hook, bet he'd frost it with that grin. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, saying frosting was my bluff, bet I'd botch the bake. I laughed, flirty, saying botching was my kick, bet he'd eat it anyway. He smirked, handed me a tray, muttering eating was my trap, bet I'd hook him crumbly. I dropped dough balls, flirty, and we started bickering about recipes. He swore by extra sugar. I pushed for more salt, flirty, saying I'd outbake him, bet I'd steal the tray. He laughed, said I'd ruin it, I bet I'd make rocks. I waved the spoon, flirty, daring him, bet I'd win. He smirked, swiped a pinch of flour, dusting my cheek, muttering winning was my chaos, bet I'd stain him worse. I squealed, flirty, grabbing a handful, tossing it at his flannel, and we broke into a flour fight, clouds puffing, the kitchen a haze, my knee brushing his thigh as I dodged. I teased his cookies were bland, bet I'd spice them up. He lunged, smearing flour on my tea, laughing, muttering spicing was my snare, bet I'd burn him out. The floor slickened with flour, and I slipped, my foot skidding, gasping as I flailed. Aiden Dove, his arms wrapping my waist, pulling me upright, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a disaster, bet I'd wreck his batch. My pulse raced, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my vibe, bet he'd save the cookies. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing saving was my hustle, bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd bake it anyway. We cleaned the mess, flour clinging, and I grabbed a rag, wiping the counter, flirty, saying he looked too good dusted, bet he'd spark my sweets. He smirked, took it, his fingers grazing mine, muttering sparking was my tangle, bet I'd burn him messy. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying burning was my rush, bet he'd fan it sharp. We negotiated a mock fine, I'd owe him a fresh batch, flirty, teasing he'd pick oatmeal, bet I'd sneak chocolate. He laughed, said I'd bake trouble, bet I'd crumble the lot, the oven beeped, cookies golden, and I leaned in, flirty, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the tray, muttering flaring was my chaos, bet I'd mess him up. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying messing was my bet he'd bite it hard. The tension hummed, the kitchen warm, and I knew I'd hooked him. The flour settled, stakes soaring. Mom's return from her late shifts loomed, her last text betting I'd stayed focused, blind to my 2-week spark with Aiden in our Denver home. I craved intensity, coaxing him to a poetry reading at a cozy bookstore, its dim lights flickering. In a sweater and jeans, I pulled him through the crowd, his flannel sharp. He grumbled I'd start a verse riot, bet I'd drag him in. I grinned, a flirty, nudging his arm, saying he looked hot with words, bet he'd rhyme my vibe. The room buzzed, poets snapping, wine flowing. I challenged him to read a poem, flirty, saying he'd choke, bet I'd outshine him. He smirked, grabbed a book, muttering choking was my trap, bet I'd fumble. I picked a sultry verse, reading close, my shoulder brushing his chest, teasing he'd better match, bet he'd flare. He read, voice low, his hand brushing mine, saying flaring was my mess, bet I'd burn the stage. The crowd clapped, and I swayed, tripping into his chair, my hands on his arms, flirty, giggling he looked too good, bet he'd catch me. He steadied me, grip warm, muttering catching was my chaos, bet I'd hook him. Doubt crept in, was this too far? I wanted more, heart racing, but paused, flirty, saying he was too steady, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, hand brushing my shoulder, muttering chasing was my hustle, bet I'd blaze him out. I grinned, hooked tight, poems wild, stakes wilder, the morning after the poetry reading, with Mom's late shifts winding down, her last text a terse bet I'd stayed on track was a wild miss. The Denver air was sharp, a storm brewing, and I, Emma, 19, was restless, the heat of Aiden's steady gaze and warm grip from the bookstore still pulsing in my veins. I'd been dancing a dangerous line with him, 55, ex-newspaper editor turned freelancer, over 2 weeks, and the spark had ignited a fire I couldn't douse. Mom's return to regular hours loomed, but I craved one final push, something to test the edge we'd been teetering on. I found Aiden in his home office, a cluttered sanctuary of books, manuscripts, and a faint jazz hum from a radio. He was typing, his faded flannel open over a dark tee, jeans worn, gray stubble catching the desk lamp's glow. I leaned on the doorframe, in a loose sweater and jeans, flirty, saying he looked hot with words, bet he'd write me something wild. He smirked, saved his file, and said wild didn't flirt, bet I'd wreck his draft. I stepped inside, my hip brushing a bookshelf, teasing that wrecking was my art, bet he'd edit it sharp. He glanced up, his hand brushing a pen by my wrist, fingers lingering, muttering editing was my dodge, bet I'd throw his focus off. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying throwing was my spark, bet he'd catch it clean. He smirked, pushed his laptop aside, his arm grazing mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this page. I flirty proposed a writing challenge, co-write a short story, something raw, bet I'd outshine him. He raised an eyebrow, teasing raw was my trap, bet I'd smudge the ink. I grabbed a notebook, sitting close, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, saying smudging was my vibe, bet he'd pen it anyway. He took the pen, his hand guiding mine to jot a line, muttering penning was my hustle, bet I'd hook him deep. I leaned in, my shoulder grazing his chest, flirty, teasing he was too strict, bet he'd write something hot. His breath caught, his fingers tightening, eyes darkening as they flicked to my lips, muttering hot was my rush, bet I'd drag him down. The notebook crinkled, and we started bantering about the story. He pushed for gritty realism, I argued for poetic flair. Flirty, saying I'd outcraft him, bet I'd steal the plot. He laughed, said I'd ramble, bet I'd bore the reader. I waved the pen, flirty, daring him, bet I'd win. He smirked, leaned closer, his hand brushing my back to check a line, his touch warm, lingering, muttering winning was my chaos, bet I'd burn his desk. I tilted in, my lips hovering near his, flirty, whispering burning was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. The air snapped, his hand sliding to my waist, pulling me closer, his breath sharp, teasing biting was my snare, bet I'd blaze him raw, thunder rumbled, and guilt crashed in, this was wrong, a betrayal I couldn't justify. I froze, pushing back, my hands on his chest, muttering I can't, bet this was a mistake. He stepped away, hands dropping, stunned, saying mistakes were my deal, bet I'd run now. I shook my head, heart pounding, saying running was right, bet he'd see why. I bolted to my room, the storm breaking, and called Mom, voice trembling, spilling everything, 2 weeks of flirting, the almost in his office. She was livid, her voice cutting, saying I'd broken her trust, bet I'd regret it. She demanded I come home. Catching an early shift end, Mom confronted me in the living room, eyes blazing, saying I'd shattered her world, bet I'd schemed it. I swore I'd stopped, confessed to fix it, bet she'd see my truth. She wavered, saying truth wasn't enough, bet I'd wounded her deep. A neighbor's gossip about our fairground laughs had fueled her doubts, bet I'd lied, she said. I hadn't, but the truth stung worse. Aiden stayed silent, his office dark, and I packed for Lila's, saying I'd stay a month, bet I'd rebuild. Mom nodded, voice softer, saying rebuilding was my path, bet I'd come back whole. I left, rain falling, Lila texting, you okay? Bet you're tough. I clutched the Polaroid, Aiden's shadow gone, stakes new, bet I'd rise. The Denver dawn was sharp, sunlight slicing through the haze as I, Emma, 19, slumped on Lila's couch, the weight of my confession to Mom about my 2-week flirtation with Aiden, 55, ex-newspaper editor, pressing hard. Her voice, raw with betrayal, had echoed, bet you'd regret it, as she sent me to Lila's to learn. I'd stopped short of crossing a line in his office, but the neighbor's gossip about our fairground laughs had deepened her distrust. Lila's apartment, a cluttered haven of incense, coffee, and punk posters, was my temporary refuge, but the Polaroid from Aiden, my blurry garage laugh, his note you're sparks enough, bet you'll shine, sat heavy in my pocket, a reminder of the fire I'd sparked. I fiddled with my phone, his last text unanswered, you did right. Bet you're still glowing. My heart twisted, knowing I'd lit it, bet I'd have to douse it. Lila, sprawled on a beanbag, caught my brooding and teased, saying I looked like a storm, bet I'd spill the dirt. I grinned, flirty despite the ache, saying spilling was my spark, bet she'd guess wrong. She smirked, tossing a zine, saying I'd tangled with someone forbidden, bet it was a wreck. I sidestepped, muttering wrecks were my rush, bet I'd fix it. But the truth clawed, Aiden's hands guiding my pen, his laugh at the fair, his pull in the office. I'd stopped, but the thrill lingered, a dangerous pulse I wasn't sure I could quiet. That afternoon, I slipped into a downtown cafe, the air thick with espresso and fresh bread, needing space from Lila's prodding. I was sketching a poem on a napkin, words spilling like regret, when Aiden walked in, his flannel open over a dark tee, a notebook tucked under his arm, gray stubble sharp in the light. My stomach flipped, and he saw me, his smirk soft, saying I looked anchored, bet I'd drift anyway. I leaned on the table, flirty, saying drifting was my vibe, bet he'd trailed me here. He grabbed a coffee, his hand brushing the napkin by my wrist, muttering trailing was my dodge, bet I'd hook him again. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd bite it still. We sat, the cafe humming with clinking mugs, and I teased he looked too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He leaned closer, his knee grazing mine, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd burn him out. I pulled the Polaroid out, flirty, saying his shot was gold, bet he'd meant it. He nodded, his hand brushing the table, saying gold was my style, bet I'd keep it. I admitted I'd told Mom, stopped for her, bet he'd think I'd caved. He didn't, muttering caving wasn't my deal, bet I'd shine through. The tension crackled, but I pulled back, saying I needed to fix this, bet he'd respect it. He smirked, his hand brushing mine, muttering respect was my call, bet I'd spark again. Back at Lila's, Mom's silence loomed. That evening, I called, asking to meet. At home, she stood in the living room, eyes weary, saying I'd hurt her, bet I'd schemed. I swore I'd confess to heal, stopped for us, bet she'd see my truth. She wavered, saying truth wasn't enough, bet I'd scarred her trust. A neighbor's photo of us at the poetry reading, too close, had reignited her doubts. I bet I'd lied, she said. I hadn't, but the truth cut deep. Mom softened, saying healing was my path. Bet I'd earn it back. As we talked, a delivery arrived, a small envelope from Aiden, a printed poem we'd read together, with a note, "Your words stay. Bet you'll write on." Mom saw, her voice easing, saying words were my chance. Bet I'd take it. I decided to stay with Lila for a month, saying I'd rebuild. Bet I'd return whole. Mom nodded, saying rebuilding was my shot. Bet I'd rise. I left, the city bright, Lila texting, poems fire. Bet you're soaring? I held the print, Aiden's shadow fading, stakes new. Bet I'd shine.